Good morning.
Congressman, what do you make of the loss of Senator Lugar? We've been talking about that this morning, looking at what it means for the Tea Party, and also looking at what it means for moderates. What do you think?
Well, I think it means quite a few things for Washington. I think it's going to send another message that we've got a lot of work to do. And America's still $15.8 trillion in debt, and folks are worried. I hear that in Kansas, and I'm sure we're hearing the same thing in Indiana. Folks are not worried about today. They're worried about what's happening in the future for the children and grandchildren. I think that seemed to be the main issue there, ready to make a change to save our country.
USA Today has an op-ed piece that says that Lugar joins a long list of lawmakers who face the ire of their party's voters for occasionally finding common cause with the other side. And it says that he could hardly be called a moderate because he opposed many of the main tenets of the Obama administration, also backs a flat consumption tax advocated by wealthy wage earners, but he has worked across party lines. What kind of a message does this send about bipartisanship?
Well, I think, again, it's not about bipartisanship. This was obviously a Republican primary, and Mr. Murdoch said we need a more conservative senator in the United States Congress representing the state of Indiana. I'm from Kansas. I hear the same sentiment back home. Not a desire to simply to get along, but actually provide some solutions and solve the problems. And after 30-some years of trying, I think Indiana said they're ready to try someone else to fix those problems.
And you're a member of the Tea Party caucus here on Capitol Hill, also the Republican Study Committee. How do you define the Tea Party and your role in that? Because we certainly hear from callers that say it's more of a movement than it is an actual organization.
Well, I think that's right and accurate. There's multiple groups, but essentially, at least in Kansas, where I come from, Tea Party is made up. Folks are very concerned about the fact that government's bigger than ever. It's more intrusive than ever. Massive amounts of debt, massive amounts of spending, and seems to be out of control. And frankly, when we're borrowing $1.3 trillion every year to fund our overspending, they are right. And there still is that concern out there, even if they aren't marching in the streets every day. It's average, ordinary Americans concerned about their government.
As a member of the Budget Committee, what are you looking at in terms of fiscal restraint? House Republicans in this current budget battle are looking at actually boosting defense spending, cutting back on social programs. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think we could cut all the above. And folks agree and disagree on that, but we cannot disagree on the fact that we can't run trillion-dollar deficits in perpetuity. And actually, on the president's budget, he runs deficits for the next 75 years. That's unsustainable. We've got to move quickly to bring the budget in balance. Folks just have a differing opinion of how quickly we can and should do that. I helped put together with other members of the Republican Study Committee a budget that would balance in 5 years. And but that did not pass. But frankly, I don't think we have 5 years to actually fiddle around while we watch Rome burning in this overspending crisis that we face right now.
So what do you do with other House Republicans? How do you come to terms with your goals versus what the party at large is pushing?
Well, I'm one amongst 240 folks, and you learn pretty quickly, even as a freshman, it takes a number of folks to get the job done. It's just not one of us. It's a team effort, and you have to work across the party lines. But what I found in Washington oftentimes is there's an area of spending, the Democrat spending, and then there's the Republican spending, and they all come together and they don't cut each other's spending. And that has been the case, I think, for many years, which is why we've had some pretty large deficits, massive deficits under the current president, but even under the previous president, the Republican president, we had some very large deficits as well.
Here's a recent story from the Wall Street Journal this week. The House bill shields defense from cuts. House Republicans seeking to prevent defense spending cuts at the end of the year advanced a plan that would instead reduce spending on health care programs, food aid, and other major domestic initiatives of the Obama administration. The bill, developed by the House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan, Republican of Wisconsin, would cut about $261 billion in domestic spending over the next decade and roll back portions of the 2010 health care law and the Dodd-Frank financial overhaul.
And your question about that was?
Well, so my question would be, I don't know if you wanted to react or not, but
yeah.
My question would be, how do you come to terms with this defense spending protection? As you mentioned, you'd like to see everything cut. You're happy with these cuts, you're content with these cuts, but you want to see more and deeper.
Well, I think we have to roll back to the debt deal in August, in which the federal government was given an opportunity to borrow another $2.1 trillion, and at that time we were promised an amount of cuts. This is an attempt to move the cuts around, but we still have to make those cuts. But
so should sequestration be off the table?
No, I think it probably will need to happen, because that is what occurred. That was the deal. And but again, the amount of cuts that would have to occur. But what folks tell me they're frustrated about is Washington was given another $2.1 trillion to spend, but not a single item has been cut yet. I mean, there's some minor things that have been cut, but most of the cuts, the vast majority of the cuts, won't occur until after the next election, till next year. And we're still talking about cuts next year when we have a 1 point whatever trillion dollar deficit this year. And that's the major concern most Tea Party folks have. Most average Americans say we can't run those deficits. We've got to do something about it. It's a spending problem, not a revenue problem, and there's plenty of ways to look at cuts, which is why I was sitting on the floor last night, helped voting on cut after cut that were being offered by various Republicans, particularly freshmen.
Our guest is Congressman Tim Huelskamp, Republican of Kansas. He's a freshman. In addition to his service in Congress, he's also a farmer and a rancher. Let's hear from the calls. Doris is a Democrat joining us from Chicago. Go ahead, Doris.
Thank you. Number one, Lugar was not a moderate Republican. He was a very conservative Republican. Number two, conservative Republicans cannot be trusted to keep their words. This sequence stretch, the budget plan was supposed to be in effect, but now you guys are cutting everything. You cut the WIC nutrition program to finance your tax cuts for the rich. And you need to stop calling yourself the small government party. You folks are passing all these big government intrusive laws all over the country. You're the vaginal probe party. You're the voter suppression party. All these laws are big, intrusive government.
Well, there's certainly a lot of intrusive laws, and myself, I've opposed quite a few of those, and I appreciate that concern, and that's the concern of most Americans. It's not about a particular party. And when we talk about debt in Washington, there's no Republican debt, there's no Democrat debt, there's American debt, there's American problem. And that's what I hear from constituents. They want some solutions. They're tired of the bickering. That's always taken place in our country. But they know we have to reduce spending. And frankly, the greatest issue in that is I was in the Budget Committee earlier this week, I believe it was. We were debating food stamps. In the last decade, there's been a 270% increase in food stamp spending. We talked about reducing a small, minor percentage of that, and folks are like, well, you can't take a few percent after you raise it 270%. That's out of control spending. And frankly, Americans cannot afford it. I did a polling of my constituents last night. 90% of constituents in Kansas that were on the phone with me says we've got to reduce spending, including food stamps, including nearly every program. That's what I tell them when I've done town hall after town hall in my district.
Politico has a story this week looking at the money spent by former presidents and what the taxpayers actually pay. It says Bush had an $80,000 phone bill. Taxpayers picked up the tab for Bill Clinton's $579,000 office rent and George W. Bush $80,000 phone bill in 2010, according to a report Tuesday that notes Americans ponied up more than $3 million of expenses to the country's four surviving former presidents.
Yeah, those are pretty expensive. That's a great example. Each of our congressional offices is given a particular budget, depending on the size of our district, where we're at. And I got together with some of my fellow freshmen, and we refused to spend everything we were given. And I remember a reporter said, well, that's only a few $1 million that you're going to turn back amongst these 10 freshmen. And that's not much in the big picture of things. I said, if everybody in Washington would cut 10%, like I did in my office, and my colleagues did, freshman colleagues, we'd finally start to get something. But millions do add up to billions, and billions add up to trillions. But the point is, every day in America, we're borrowing $3 to $4 billion to fund this overspending, and that's unsustainable. And whether you're Republican or Democrat, we should be concerned, as are the folks that are funding this spending spree.
Brandywine, Maryland. Emma, independent caller. Go ahead. Hi, Emma. Emma, last try. You're on the program.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
What's your name?
My name's Tom.
Okay, Tom. Where are you calling from?
Calling from Dayton, Ohio.
All right. Welcome. Go ahead. You're on with Representative Huelskamp.
Hi. I really think it's a mixture. We have to cut, but we also have to have revenue. I just can't see the philosophy where I'm going to go to Apple, and this guy that's running Apple can make $167,000 an hour, and he don't need taxed, and he pays his employees $1 an hour. I mean, this is crazy.
Okay, so disparity among pay, what CEOs make versus the average worker?
Well, you don't want Washington actually dictating what folks get paid, and we'll see what happens. We'll have the same disparity or the same budget deficits we have now. I know that's a concern, but that frankly is how the system works. Some folks make more than others. Folks that do a good job generally get rewarded, and it's the job in Washington, I think, is to make sure we have a level, fair playing field. But the gentleman, Tom, did mention the issue of taxes. I think he would want higher taxes on somebody else, but the reality is 49% of Americans pay no federal income taxes. When I talk to folks in Kansas, they're like, well, if we're going to make it more fair, most folks should have to pay part of that system and should have to fund their government. And the top 1%, I know the president always talks about that, they already pay 38% of all the federal income taxes, which is probably the most progressive system in the world. And the idea is somehow we're going to get everybody to pay more, or at least a certain share to pay more. And meanwhile, we can't cut spending in this place. It's a spending, not a revenue problem, and that's how we're going to solve and provide a solution to our deficit crisis.
Let's hear from a Republican. Nick joins us from Fairfax, Virginia, close to D.C. Go ahead, Nick.
Hi, good morning, Congressman. Thank you for being on today. Really
good morning.
And C-SPAN, thank you for the programming. This is some fantastic stuff. I had a question for the Congressman. Actually, it's since changed since I heard your remarks about the food stamp, so I wanted to kind of tie this in. My original question was, you're focusing on cutting the government and cutting what we see as waste from the government, or maybe just programs that we'd like to do but can't really afford to do in this type of an economy. What are your thoughts on the other side of that coin as far as either increasing the base or increasing the tax rate to raise revenue? And also tied with that, you talked about the food stamp spending increasing by 270% or some such number.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask also then, that safety net is there, and to say that our spending has increased and calling that a problem, I see that more as more people are falling off the bridge and landing in that safety net, and that's why maybe the spending is increasing as opposed to the program itself is out of control. I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Nick, I appreciate that. There's a few things that certainly in the Obama economy, it's the weakest economic recovery, I believe, since the Great Depression. The average wait for Americans in the Obama economy to find a new job is 39 weeks. If you were to start today, if a college graduate were to start today, it'd be Valentine's Day next year before they would find a job on average. I mean, that's a very, very weak economy. But the figure I gave, about a 270% increase in food stamps. At the same time, during that 10-year period, we had 19 million Americans on food stamps 10 years ago. Today, we have over 44 million Americans on the food stamps. Part of it's because the economy is so poor under the President Obama. The other part of it is, during the stimulus package, there was a huge increase in expansion of the program. And so it's multiple parts, as Nick has mentioned. But he asked a question about raising revenue. If nothing changes in Washington, current law would mean that we will have the single largest tax increase in our entire history will take place at the end of this year. All the Bush-Obama tax cuts will expire. We will have higher death taxes. We will have higher marginal income taxes. We will have higher capital gains rates. And so for the folks out there that are looking for a tax increase, including the president, if nothing happens in Washington, we will have the biggest tax increase, which will be devastating to our economy. And I'm very concerned about that, in particular because it seems neither party has a real workable plan to avoid this tax increase cliff that's coming at the end of the year.
So I come back to this question of how do you, as a freshman, make some inroads? How do you go back to voters as you run for re-election this fall and say, okay, well, my party may not be supporting everything that I want, but I'm still what? There's prospects for change. How do you convince them that your message and your point can make a difference here in Washington?
Well, in the last year and a half, I've done 119 town halls in the district, and which is unusual, the numbers of those. But what I tell folks is Washington really makes me depressed when you see what's happening up here, the spending that never seems to change. But when I go home and see the American people, at least the folks in Kansas, that's why I'm optimistic. It isn't Washington that's going to solve our problems. It's called elections and the American people getting engaged. That's always how it's been solved. Usually it's Washington that follows the rest of America, and I think that's the case today. The American people get it. They know we're in a spending problem. And I also talk about the 40% rule, and they say, well, what's the 40% rule? What's the rule that every dime we spend in Washington today, 40% of that's borrowed? That means for every amount we spend today, our children and grandchildren are going to pay 40% of that off sometime in the future. That's a huge threshold. It's unsustainable, and we need more revenues, but we do that by growing the economy. The Republican plan that passed, which I do support in part, is we'd have a 2 tax rate. We'd flatten the system, remove most of the special interest loopholes, and that way we can focus on most Americans pay the rates and get on with doing their business. I think that would grow the economy, create more revenue just by flattening the tax code.
Congressman Tim Huelskamp, Republican of Kansas. Let's hear from Patty, who's a Democrat in Sterling, Virginia.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I guess I'd like to start my comments off with this congressman has his rhetoric practiced well, but this is not the Obama economy. That's the first point I'd like to make. This is the result of almost 8 full years of Republican control of both the executive and legislative branches. And instead of the listening to a prominent Princeton economist, who I believe is a Nobel Prize winner, Paul Krugman, whose basic point is we can't cut our way into growth. These Tea Party activists think they know better, think that, this knee-jerk whiplash reaction to what the Bush administration brought us to, which was, as we've said many, many times, the brink of the worst, economic crisis since the Depression, which President Obama has worked furiously to keep us from snapping back there, while he's trying to deal with this reactionary Congress that says, just cut, and somehow that's going to stimulate the economy. And one more point, the defense budget, which the Republicans consistently protect, and I worked in the Pentagon for 20 years, I know intimately it is the biggest stimulus package this world has ever known, and they never acknowledge that, and it's ridiculous.
Patty, we'll get a response from our guest, but first, I'm sure you've noticed that we are going to have Paul Krugman on later on this morning. He'll be joining us in about 45 minutes or so, half an hour actually, so you can stay tuned to hear him. Congressman Huelskamp, how do you react to Patty's concerns both about whose fault it is and then about defense spending being essentially a stimulus? Well,
I think Patty knows the president has been Barack Obama for over 3 years. I mean, when is it someone else's fault? And trying to determine fault oftentimes doesn't work. I've got a number of teenage kids and younger kids, and everybody wants to blame each other. But the point is, President Obama's been president for over 3 years. On the first day of his presidency, for example, the price of gasoline was $1.89. Look at what we're paying today, $3 and $4 in this particular area. The deficit was well below half of what it is today. This is the only president in history who's run trillion-dollar deficits. He's run it for 4 straight years. And I would love to hear what Mr. Krugman says about economics, because he was dead wrong on the stimulus. They promised us if we borrowed over $800 billion in the stimulus package that our unemployment rate would never be below 8%. Here we are, I think, after how many years later? It's still above 8%. And we have another $800 billion in debt with interest, $1.1 trillion. It's time to quit blaming folks. It's time for this president and his supporters to say their policies have failed. And hopefully that in this debate during the presidential campaign, we're focused on the fact that the president's policies have failed. It doesn't work to borrow and spend our way to prosperity, even though liberal economists suggest that would work. It did not work. It was a massive failure. It's very clear from the numbers.
Let's look at the unemployment numbers, both nationally and in your home state of Kansas. Nationally, it's 8.1%. And then in Kansas, where our guest hails from, it's 6.1%. We're getting those numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Daniel writes in on Twitter and asks whether you'd be willing to stop all tax breaks for millionaires and people richer than millionaires.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anybody needs to pay more in taxes until we get our spending under control. The last time Washington actually reduced its spending year to year, the last time was before Elvis's first album. Americans have a right to be skeptical, because it seems the Republicans talk they're going to cut spending, and the Democrats say they're going to cut spending, and then you look at the facts. Again, it's been decades since we actually cut spending year to year. But if you hear the rhetoric in this town, boy, there's massive spending cuts. Actually, they're usually only talking about cutting the rate of growth in spending. And frankly, when we're borrowing $1 trillion a year plus, and we've done 4 years in a row under this president, that's unsustainable. It's doing long-term damage to our economy.
Our guest, Representative Huelskamp, is on the Budget Committee, and we mentioned this story from the Wall Street Journal looking at House Republicans, how they want to prevent defense spending cuts, so have advanced a plan in the Budget Committee that would instead reduce spending on health care programs, food aid, and other major domestic initiatives of the Obama administration. Well, the ranking Democrat on your committee pushed back, Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland. Let's hear what he had to say.
The plan before us is flawed for several reasons. First, it is only for 1 year, and even then, it doesn't totally remove the sequester. It lifts the sequester for discretionary spending, but leaves it in place for all mandatory spending except defense. As a result, it keeps the 2% across the board cut in Medicare, for example. Second, it continues the lopsided approach of the full Republican budget, protecting those special interest tax breaks at the expense of vital safety net programs.
What do you think of Congressman Van Hollen's comments?
Well, they're typical partisan comments. I understand that, but folks always say, well, golly, gee, you can't cut my spending. And I would just like to try it once in Washington, because I support more cuts in defense than many of my Republican colleagues, but what I also support is actually looking at waste and food stamps and all the growth in stimulus spending. And the general Republican approach in the House has been to roll back spending to pre-stimulus levels. Most Americans said 2008 spending, 2007 spending, that was big enough already. And the idea that we can't roll back to a few years ago, the idea we can't cut 10% after growing food stamps by 270%. We can't afford 260% growth in food stamps. And again, it's that 40% rule that Mr. Van Hollen and others like us to forget is we are burdening our children and grandchildren, the idea that they're the ones that are going to pay for this spending. And I just had a conversation on Skype with some 4th and 5th graders in Emporia, Kansas, and a young man asked me, it probably came from his parents, he said, well, why are our taxes always seem to be going up? Because our spending, I said, keeps going up. And even our taxes are higher, our spending is higher, and end result is our economy is moving slower.
Spartanburg, South Carolina, Henry, independent caller.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, C.
Good morning.
I think, this is enough of this foolishness. First of all, the poor did not create this economic depression that we're in. It was 2 unfunded wars, tax breaks to the rich, and now it's almost as if the poor are the one that got us into this mess. And the banner on your screen this morning reads, boost defense spending and cut social programs. Well, we had 10 years of war that is initially funded off budget. I think it was a Republican president, by the way, by the name of Dwight Eisenhower, who warned us about the military-industrial complex. And it's the very thing that's being promulgated by this congressman and the Republican Party. And it was the Republican president that warned us about perpetual military-industrial complex spending. It's so hypocritical. And don't forget that this is the same party that drove us into this economic recession. When Bill Clinton left office, there was a budget surplus. We came in, funded wars off budget, came in, gave tax cuts that were off the budget, and now all of a sudden they become just this great watchman over the American economy. It's just hypocritical foolishness.
Yeah, I am a freshman. I'd love to take credit for all good things and not be blamed for any bad things, but those things all did occur. But here's the current scenario. We're $15.8 trillion in debt. Spending is out of control. It's continuing to grow. They're not cutting spending. It's going to be expected to grow and grow. Under the president's budget, he has proposed to borrow another $8 to $9 to $10 trillion over the next decade. I'm here to tell you, I don't think that's even possible. Libby and Henry, and the spending has to be cut on both sides, on the defense side and the social welfare side. It is unsustainable. I think we've overextended ourselves around the world. I think most Americans would agree with that. But frankly, the idea we can continue to spend and borrow, but we have a presidential campaign going on. It's this president that actually extended the Bush tax cuts. We call them the Bush-Obama tax cuts. He said the last thing you want to do in the middle of a recession, and rarely do I agree with President Obama, you don't raise taxes in a recession. Folks, we're still in a slow economy. I think we'll probably be in a recession, and the idea at the end of the year we're going to raise taxes on every American taxpayer. Everybody. Rich and poor alike, the 51% that pay taxes, the idea that that's going to create more jobs is silly. And the idea we can continue to spend at tremendous levels out of control is that's unsustainable. Most American people would say, hey, cut the spending. Let's start now. Let's start with both sides. You cut the Republican spending, you cut the Democrat spending, and let's get this budget in balance. I proposed one to do that in 5 years, and folks at home say, why are you waiting 5 years? Well, the Obama proposal is to never balance in 75 years. The Republican proposal would balance in 20-some years. And the middle ground is, I don't think we can wait more than 5 years, but we'll see what happens.
How much of an ear do you have of House Speaker John Boehner?
Well, that depends. I think the freshman class gets a lot of attention as a whole, and it's not a one-man show or one-woman show in our nation's capital. It's about working together, and I think there's a pretty good group of us that have a strong impact on driving the House more conservative, more to what the American people are looking for. This is, in 2006, Republicans were in control, and then we had Speaker Pelosi for 4 years, and now we're on a new speaker. I think we've helped change the House, and I think House leadership, at least on the Republican side, is very attuned to what Republicans like myself, freshmen, are looking for.
Would you see the House leadership staying the same if Republicans hold on to the House?
It seems to be the case.
Would you like to see someone more conservative or more in line with Tea Party, member of the Tea Party committee even?
I think this election is actually going to be more about the presidential side. But before we get to the new Congress, we will have what they call lame duck hell. After the next election, we're going to run out of money. They're going to want to borrow, more borrowing authority. We'll probably have no budget. We have this huge, massive tax increase. We have numerous other programs that are going to expire at the end of the year. And folks said, hey, what's going to happen on January 20th? I'm worried what happens at the end of the year, is this could be devastating. We could jeopardize once again our financial rating by what we do. If we do the wrong thing at the end of the year, if we continue to spend and borrow, I think we're going to lose our AAA credit rating if we're not careful.
Judy, Republican in Annapolis, Maryland, welcome.
Yes, good morning. I just have a quick question for the Congressman. There was an article in the Washington Post last year about $60 billion being sent to the Middle East, and a large part of that money was missing, and they didn't know where it was initially, and then it was determined that it was, that it ended up in Al-Qaeda and Taliban's hands. And there was another book that just came out, Funding the Enemy, that talks about how American taxpayer money is literally being used to finance the terrorists overseas. And as I said, that article in the Washington Post said that a lot of that money, billions of dollars, ended up to finance the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So I have a question for you. Can you explain to me if anybody in Congress is investigating that, and if there has been any progress made to determine who's responsible for that kind of irresponsibility? This is just unbelievable that our troops are being sent overseas and give their lives, and we're financing the other side behind closed doors as well.
We'll leave it there, Judy, and get a response from our guest.
Yeah, I'm unaware of the situation, but I honestly believe there's been billions of dollars wasted overseas. Whether or not you supported the wars and those activities, frankly, the effort's been throwing a lot of money at a problem, and I don't think in many cases it has worked. But a lot of that also comes back to our foreign aid programs, which I think is about $30 billion a year. Yes, we are giving money to folks that detest us. And you want about the value of giving $1.5 billion every year to Pakistan. But the largest share of our foreign aid dollars, or not the largest share, the large single recipient is the State of Israel. Democrats and Republicans alike think we ought to support our ally Israel, and we should do that very clearly.
Our guest, Congressman Huelskamp, is on the Budget Committee. As we mentioned, he also serves on the Agriculture Committee and Veterans Affairs. There's a story from the Associated Press saying that members of Congress are expressing doubt on plans by the VA to hire 1,900 additional workers to improve access to mental health care. This comes on the heels of an Inspector General report that found that the wait time for members of the military veterans to get mental health both consultations and also care is far more delayed than the VA was letting on. What do you think about these new workers that the VA wants to bring on?
Well, we heard yesterday in testimony of the VA committee and heard from looking at those reports that clearly no one's for sure how long you have to wait. They don't even know how to measure that accurately. They're using old computer systems, I think more than a decade, aged computer systems. And the idea we can't find a way to actually track how long folks that served our country have to wait for mental health services. And just adding more people, adding more folks in the bureaucracy is not going to solve that problem. It's a systemic problem, which is typical for bureaucracies. And but we'll look closely at that. But again, spending more money obviously doesn't always solve the problem.
What would your solution be? What
my solution? Let's find out how long veterans have to wait for their mental health services. I come from a very rural district. Putting another a few thousand folks to work excuse me, in the VA system doesn't help you when you live 300 miles away from a VA hospital, as you might be in my district. So we have to look at other options. We have to use local community services, and they talk about that. But again, it's always wrapped around more bureaucracy. And there was a report, as you indicate, and then just a few weeks later, they said we got to hire more people. When we found a lot of discrepancies in the system, and we're working hard to save that and improve that. But again, as the caller indicated, Judy, this is a massive budget, massive programs, $3.8 trillion of spending, and trying to find out where it's being wasted is a full-time job, and Congress is on duty on both parties trying to look closely at that.
Representative Huelskamp represents the 1st District in Kansas. That includes Dodge City, Hutchinson, and Salina. Charlie, Democratic caller in Houston. Good morning.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Congressman Huelskamp, it has taken approximately over 3 decades to get us to the national debt that we're at. All of that was supply-side economic policies. You expect, and your GOP and the Tea Party expect, that we're going to change everything overnight when it took over 3 decades to get us where we're at. The solution, in my opinion, is gradually reduce the spending, but you have to do compromise. There has to be compromise because spending is a big issue, but unfair taxation is another. I mean, there's taxes for the rich, excuse me, that the tax relief for the rich, you know, you're claiming that the Bush tax cuts are going to expire and it'll be the biggest tax increase. Well, it may be an increase at that level, at that point, but it's been a drain on us.
Let's leave it there and get a response from the congressman.
Well, one thing to remember, these are not the Bush tax cuts. They're the Bush-Obama tax cuts. President Obama, about a year and a half ago, extended those tax cuts. And at that time, he said 85% of those tax cuts go to the middle or lower classes. And the reason more don't go to middle or lower tax classes is, again, 49% of Americans, according to independent numbers, actually pay no federal income taxes. We have the most progressive income tax system in the world, but it is a mess. It's decades and decades, as Charlie mentioned, of special interest handouts, loopholes, credits. We have over $1 trillion of tax credits of what they call tax expenditures in the tax code. Tax code's that big. It's based on power in Washington, D.C., giving handouts to special interests. I think we ought to throw out the whole tax code, and that actually is the proposal in the Republican House, even though it's not in a bill. That's been my concern. We need to put in details. Let's get on with it. And one thing we can circle on our calendars, April 1st, 2012. What's so special about April 1st, 2012? That's when America became the highest tax country in the world for businesses and or corporations. We're number one. And somehow the idea that we could raise our status to even higher, that we could go increase our already highest tax rates in the world and somehow expect American businesses to compete. I mean, Charlie, what has occurred is not 3 decades of overspending that's added to that. I mean, there's been a significant amount of that. But the tremendous increase under this president, they have added $5 trillion in new debt out of that $15.8 trillion. This president promised us he'd cut the deficit in half when it was about $500 billion. Instead, he doubled the deficit. And that happened under a Democrat president and Democrat Congress. Remember, before that, we had Speaker Pelosi for the 2 years before that, and the idea that we can continue to spend and borrow and spend, and then regulate. We're going to talk about that as well. And somehow the economy is going to grow. I'm frankly surprised the economy continues to grow, even with these very negative indicators and pressures coming out of Washington.
Wabasha, Minnesota. Jack, Independent Line. Good morning.
Good morning. You know, the biggest agency, the biggest bureaucracy, and you're complaining about bureaucracy and spending, is the Pentagon, the biggest agency and bureaucracy in the world. I was in the military in Vietnam, and if you want to talk about waste and inefficiency, you look to wars and the military, pal. By the way, your diagnosis of where these problems are is faulty, as is Paul Ryan's. The mandatory budget with its FICA tax was in balance virtually for the last decade. The biggest imbalance is in the discretionary budget with its dominating member, the military. I second the lady from South Carolina, the guy from South Carolina, the lady from Virginia. Of that 40% deficit that you're complaining about, it is due almost exclusively to the $1.3 trillion in military expenditure, and it's that high because you got to include the cost of our wars, which are part of the interest that we're paying, and you got to include things like the VA and the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, which oversees our nuclear stockpile. It's $1.3 trillion. If you don't address the Pentagon and address it big time, you are guilty of fiscal malpractice.
Well, I think that is something the gentleman needs to indicate to the President of the United States, actually runs the Pentagon. I actually had an exchange with Mr. Panetta and asked him about these specific questions. And he assured us that he has cut every last wasteful dime in the Pentagon. At that time, we just had found out that they were building a special soccer facility for the terrorists at Gitmo, and that he didn't know about it. Half $500,000, and but there is a tremendous waste, I believe, in multiple agencies, including the Pentagon. And but the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, is the only budget that cannot be audited. Mr. Panetta was all excited to announce by 2017 they could actually handle an audit in the Department of Defense. Every other agency in this town, in my understanding, can be audited. Department of Defense cannot. It's been happening on multiple presidents. I agree with many of these concerns, but the $1.3 trillion, that's not what we spend on the military. It's, I think, about half of that. And again, when you have a $1.3 trillion deficit, you have this current president that did not cut the defense budget. Actually, he's not proposing to cut it all. He has proposed to undo the sequester as well. I asked Mr. Panetta that. Do you have plans to implement the sequester? He said, no, the administration has told me we're not going to implement the sequester, which the defense part of the sequester. So I have some concerns that both parties in this town are not willing to cut defense. And the earlier caller talked about President Eisenhower. He actually was originally from my district, Abilene, Kansas. For a general to say that, I think had a tremendous impact and I think on America at that time, and should still today. We have to look closely at all spending, whether it's the so-called Republican spending or Democrat spending. At the end of the day, we can't afford it all.
You've been part of this monthly conversation with conservatives, something that you're chairing on Capitol Hill. Tell us about what it is. You have the third installment of that today.
Well, it's an opportunity. I consider myself a conservative, and many of our freshmen do. It's an opportunity to actually sit down and just have an open discussion with members of the media and our colleagues. And we have about a dozen members show up. We just take questions, and it's amazing. Congress has changed so much in, say, the last 20 years. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, the idea that some freshman members of Congress, newly elected, can actually visit and express an opinion and attempt to influence the process is unusual. Usually they'd make you wait for a decade, but it's such a huge freshman class, and because the Congress is more transparent, the entire policy process is much more transparent. It needs to be enhanced, but conversations with conservatives, opportunity for us to get our message out and talk about what we're hearing back home. And it's amazing what folks hear that Americans are not concerned about tomorrow necessarily. My constituents are going to be saying, Tim, I'm concerned about what happens with my children and grandchildren. And we have a massive financial crisis coming our way, and it's not about defense spending, it's not about the VA spending, it's about our spending on health care. Medicare is going to eat our lunch. We know that because every day in America we have 10,000 baby boomers that turn 65. They're going on Medicaid and Medicare. And what the Republican proposal has been, the Paul Ryan budget and many other proposals related to that, is to reform and save Medicare, because that's where the real crushing impact on our budget is going to be, is all these retirees, and there's no plan in Washington right now to deal with that.
Question on Twitter wants to know if you would take the food stamp challenge, like Congressman Ryan, Democrat of Ohio, did for a month, and then decide to cut it. Susie Q says, you try and live on it. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure what the food stamp challenge is. I assume it's...
Living on the food stamp. Living on food stamps, yeah.
Well, the idea in America is not that people live on food stamps. The best way for people is actually have a paycheck rather than a welfare check. And that's what makes, I think, this president different than myself and others. I mean, the idea that he sees 44.7 million Americans, almost 45 million Americans on food stamps, and says, boy, look at what we're doing. I would rather see no one on food stamps. Let's get the economy growing again. But the prescription for economic growth by this administration has been abject failure by their own definition. We had this entire stimulus package, and which is going to eventually cost us $1.1 trillion. And they promised us the unemployment rate would not go over 8%. It's never been under 8%. Actually, I believe the unemployment rate today, if they had done nothing, would have been 6%. I'll take 6% over 8% any day. And so the idea that we can't shave a few percentage of off of the massive spending in food stamps. Let me give you one example, though, on food stamps that really upsets me. Washington, D.C., and I think 16 different states had a little scheme, and they're still doing it, where they'll mail an individual a $1 check, someone who does not qualify for food stamps. By mailing them a $1 check or a $5 check, that makes them qualify for food stamps when they otherwise do not qualify. I don't think there's an American here, and certainly nobody in Washington, D.C., that says, if you can't make it, we're going to help you out with food stamps. But the idea that we have fraud going on that's put together by these states trying to make people qualify for food stamps that do not qualify, have sufficient income. And so it's not a question what you can live on. It's a question of whether or not we're going to allow fraud in this particular program.
So you're talking about the system. How do you get to the heart of what our tweeter is getting at when it comes to finding empathy for people who are trying to get by, who can't find a job? Some of the programs you're talking about are long-term, helping to boost unemployment rates in, say, a year, 2 years. But what about someone who doesn't have a job right now, needs to feed their family? How do you relate to them?
Well, how I relate to them is how I relate to them at home. And I believe charity starts at home, not in Washington, D.C. And for some reason, there's a lot of Americans, particularly in this town, think being charitable is giving away other people's money. And my wife and kids, and we believe in helping others. And we do that not through the heavy hand of government, doing it through our community and through our church. And that's obviously a different approach, but it's a very American approach. It's very different than the European approach, and that's the way we like it here in America.
Republican caller in Daphne, Alabama, Elaine joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning. I want to thank the congressman for all the work he's doing. But I've been a Republican for many years now, but I don't agree with not taxing the ultra-wealthy. I think it would go a long way in the perception of what Republicans are trying to do if they would tax the wealthy. And as far as the ultra-wealthy and CEOs being job producers, I don't really agree with that, because they're the ones that sent our jobs abroad.
Yeah. Elaine, can I ask you a question, Elaine? What do you think the top maximum tax rate, what percentage should Americans pay on their income? What should be the top rate?
Well, I don't know about that, but a few years ago, I had an income, was fortunate to have an income around the $200,000, and I myself fell under the alternative minimum tax, and I was paid 38% myself. Mm-hmm. Now that has gone down, luckily for me, but I just think, when you're making, and I know it's not going to go real far as reducing the debt, but when you've got CEOs making $10 million and above, $8 million, I think they can afford to pay a whole lot more tax than a working guy that's making trying to get by on $40,000 a year now.
Yeah, and they generally do pay a higher rate. obviously, and I think that's already the system. We have already one of the most progressive systems in the world. Again, the top 1% the president likes to talk about. He goes to fundraisers with him. They donate to his campaign. And then he talks about them. They already pay 38% of our federal income tax. So 38%. But the folks, the needy, the 40,000 and under, and I know plenty of those, been in that category much of my life as well. On average, they pay no federal income taxes. The bottom 49% pay nothing. And actually about a third of those that file tax returns actually get a paycheck back. So we have a very progressive system. But the point is, it's not a revenue problem. It might make us feel good to say, hey, we're going to take more money from the head of GE. Yeah, it is wrong that GE apparently doesn't pay any income taxes. That's because of all the tax credits the politicians have put in the system. I would like to flatten the tax code, get rid of most of those tax credits, most of those spend-restricted loopholes, most of those exemptions, and make sure everybody pays a fair share. I would support a flat tax. I would support a fair tax. I would support the proposal that we've been looking at in the House, which is a two-tiered system, 25%, 10%. Make sure everybody pays, and I think you have a flatter, fair, more equalized system if we did that.
One last question for you. Is Mitt Romney reaching out to conservatives enough? He looks to be the nominee for your party.
I think we're going to be surprised by how conservative Mr. Romney will be, not during a campaign, but during his presidency.
Is that misleading if he runs on a different platform than what he plans to serve on?
No, I think he's going to talk about the same thing. What I've talked about here this morning and numerous others, talking about big picture issues. Oftentimes in elections, they're about little things, and I think most Americans get frustrated. But the big picture is America's broke. The big picture is we need more jobs. And how are we going to do that? Either we give more power to Washington, D.C. and the bureaucrats and the politicians in control of our health care, or do we give more power and control to individual Americans? You can't do both. And the problem with many campaigns is they try to say, well, I'm going to raise taxes on a few, and then I'm going to have a program here, a program there. But I think if Mr. Romney's heard on the campaign trail, which it seems to be the same, but what I heard at home is Americans are tired of that. They're looking for solutions. They're looking for solid solutions that involve personal responsibility, more Americans in control rather than more bureaucrats and politicians. So, yes, I think he's going to be reaching out to conservatives because that's what he's hearing on the campaign trail. That's how you're going to be elected. I think the president's going to try to do the same thing. Just the other day, he said it was the private sector that creates jobs. And I was shocked to hear that because, wait a minute, you're the president that said we needed to borrow $800 billion and spend it to stimulate the economy. You're going to hear economists in a little bit going to suggest the same thing, but it is the private sector that creates jobs. That's how you win elections, is you talk about that, but how you govern appropriately and effectively is actually instituting those type of proposals.
Congressman Tim Huelskamp, Republican, representing Kansas' 1st District, freshman term. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Coming up next, we'll talk with New York Times columnist